The ninth round of the 2003 Champ Car season took place in the land of the river that once caught on fire and houses for the price of a VCR, Cleveland, Ohio. The joke of Cleveland seeing the sun 3 times a year certainly rang true this weekend, as a race would be held under the lights. Security was a big issue this weekend. It being Cleveland at night, the chances of getting robbed are pretty high. I can't really judge though. At 9 Philadelphia, you'd get hit by a reckless drunk driver, land on used hypodermic needles, get kicked by a loudmouth Eagles fan, robbed by a disgruntled Phillies fan, stabbed by the only guy in the city who still supports the Flyers, then shot by someone who the police will never catch, before hopping on a SEPTA bus and getting into a car crash on the way to the hospital. Philadelphia slander notwithstanding, there isn't a whole lot to talk about in the pre-race. For the first time since round 5 at the Lausitz ring, there were no driver changes. Thank Christ. However, the race weekend itself was still dramatic. Tracy and Jourdain once again had a bit of a scuffle, this time during practice, which resulted in a pit lane shouting match. Sebastian Bourdais in his first race driving the soon-to-be famous McDonald's colors would take the pole position. Paul Tracy in his 200 series start would join him on the front row. Jeff Boss would be your last place starter, while Tiago Monteiro was withdrawn from the race after a hard crash in practice that gave him a minor concussion. A big talking point prior to the start was a washed-away rubber after a rainstorm earlier that day. The rain chance continued for the race, with a possibility of scattered thunderstorms. With everything taken care of, we can get to the start of the race. For the first time in weeks, we'd get the green flag on the first time around, and thanks to a massive overshoot going into turn 1 for your pole sitter, it was Paul Tracy taking the lead and leading the first lap of a race for the first time this season. However, the comms crew didn't notice it, and the masochists in the production hauler didn't even show a replay for them until lap 8. But while that was going on, Michel Jourdain Jr. had a big spin coming out of turn 4, and despite dropping down to the end of the field, the only damage Jourdain had was to his ego. Besides that, the start was calm, with the biggest points of excitement being the recovery driver Jourdain and the ongoing sunset. By lap 16, the classic Cleveland chaos came around. It was a turn 1 incident with Jimmy Vasser and Roberto Moreno that left Moreno stopped on track with damage. Vasser went for a dive into turn 1 and just cleaned at Moreno. It was a move as desperate as Vasser's attempts to stick it to the IRL by not racing there, even with how badly it screwed over his career. There were some pit stops during this cycle, with the order remaining the same. The green was out again, briefly, as a stopped car of Walter Salas brought the yellow back out. Salas had a broken throttle cable, so he was left stranded in turn 4 and was now out of the race. After his car was towed away, the race was back underway with Tracy still in the lead. During the following green flag stint, Bob Varsha and Tommy Kendall were talking about how Paul Tracy had donated money to Lance Armstrong's foundation, and actually spent some time with Lance in Las Vegas. Thanks to the Dinner with Racers podcast, we now know what happened.
And he walks me back into these private rooms and opens up the door, and there's Lance in there, and there's a couple of his manager guys. I can't remember the names now off the top of my head, and a couple other riders, and about 10 prostitutes. And a whole table full of alcohol, like.
The second round of pit stops came, with the order remaining the same. Really, the only point of action was Jeff Boss retiring with suspension damage, a retirement that was completely ignored by the broadcast. Then just barely over the halfway mark on lap 58, the third full course yellow came out after Rodolfo Levin spun and stalled it heading into turn 8. After CBS just barely caught the ensuing restart, the focus was on the nearing third round of pit stops for most of the field. I say most. Jimmy Vasser had pitted during the yellow thanks to a slow puncture. He would have to pit later on and was out of contention. The pit stops for the leaders came around lap 69. Nice. And even nicer was a bit of action. Sebastian Bourdais short filled to get ahead of Tracy. This pit cycle gave the lead to the aforementioned Jimmy Vasser before he pitted again on lap 83, giving the race lead to Bourdais. He maintained the lead even after the last round of pit stops. He was on his way to an easy win, but after he made contact with Adrian Fernandez, things got much harder after a late race yellow after a spin and stall for Jimmy Vasser. After a green-white checkered finish, Sebastian Bourdais would score his third win of the season. Paul Tracy would finish in second, and Bruno Junqueira would come home in third. That race was a pretty big letdown. Of the first 9 races, it's probably the third worst, up there on the podium with Long Beach and Laguna Seca. We may have a doozy on our hands next week in Toronto, and I hope y'all can join me for that race review. Thank you all for watching, and have a great afternoon.